In 1876, a doctor in Montana opened a medical journal and wrote 7 words that would haunt American medicine for over a century. The Donnelly children should not exist. He wasn't being dramatic. He was documenting something that violated every principle of human biology he'd been taught. 4 children born to the same parents, in the same isolated valley, carrying genetic markers that medical science said were impossible to combine in a single bloodline. But they existed. And the more doctors studied them, the more they realized something far darker than a medical anomaly was unfolding. This wasn't just rare genetics. This was evidence of something hidden in the American frontier, something that rewrote the rules of what we thought we knew about human inheritance, isolation, and the secrets buried in the bloodlines of the families who settled the untamed territories. What happened to the Donnelly family wasn't an accident of nature. It was a glimpse into a system of control, lineage manipulation, and genetic engineering that predates our modern understanding by centuries. And the most terrifying part? The medical establishment knew. They documented it. Then they buried it. Because what the Donnellys represented wasn't just a mystery. It was proof that someone, somewhere, had been conducting experiments on the human genome long before we had the language to describe it. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. And by the end, you'll understand why some knowledge isn't just forbidden. It's dangerous. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And the pattern is everywhere. The Donnelly family arrived in the Montana Territory in 1869. Patrick Donnelly, an Irish immigrant, and his wife Catherine, a woman whose maiden name was scrubbed from nearly every official record you can find today. Think about that for a moment. In an era obsessed with genealogy and lineage documentation, where family trees were social currency and bloodline meant everything, Catherine's origins were deliberately erased. Not lost. Erased. The family settled in a valley so remote it didn't appear on territorial maps until 1874. No neighbors within 20 miles. No church. No school. No town. Just the Donnellys, their livestock, and the Montana wilderness. By 1876, they had 4 children. Michael, age 9. Sarah, age 7. Thomas, age 5. And little Catherine, age 3. On the surface, a typical frontier family carving out survival in harsh territory. But when Michael fell ill with what the family thought was scarlet fever, everything changed. Patrick rode 3 days to bring back Dr. Henry Ashford, a physician trained at Harvard Medical School who'd come west seeking fortune and ended up documenting one of the most disturbing medical cases in American history. When Dr. Ashford examined Michael, he found symptoms consistent with the fever. But he also found something else. The boy's eyes weren't just different colors, a condition called heterochromia that's rare but documented. His eyes changed color depending on his emotional state. Not subtly. Dramatically. From deep brown to pale green, shifting in real time as the child moved from calm to distressed. Dr. Ashford had never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone else in the medical community. But that was just the beginning. Dr. Ashford stayed with the Donnelly family for 2 weeks, treating Michael and observing something that would consume the rest of his professional life. All 4 children exhibited the same eye phenomenon. Not occasionally. Constantly. Their eyes shifted through a spectrum of colors, brown, green, gray, amber, responding to emotional states with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. But it wasn't just the eyes. Dr. Ashford documented abnormalities in their skeletal structure, unusually flexible joints, elongated fingers, bone density that was 30% lower than average but somehow stronger in tensile strength. Their cognitive abilities were off the charts. Michael, at 9 years old, could perform complex mathematical calculations in his head that Dr. Ashford struggled with on paper. Sarah could recall entire conversations verbatim from weeks prior, word for word, inflection perfect. Thomas displayed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that bordered on uncanny, predicting movements and reactions before they happened. And Catherine, barely 3 years old, spoke in complete sentences with vocabulary that rivaled educated adults. This wasn't genius. This was something else. Dr. Ashford spent hours each day measuring, documenting, testing. He examined Patrick and Catherine Donnelly themselves, searching for genetic markers that might explain their children's traits. Patrick was unremarkable. Standard Irish genetic profile, no abnormalities, no extraordinary traits. But Catherine? Catherine's physiology was impossible to categorize. Her blood type didn't match any known classification. Her bone structure suggested European ancestry, but with markers that didn't align with any regional population. Her neural responses to stimuli were so rapid they bordered on precognitive. Dr. Ashford wrote in his journal, "The mother is the key, but she is a lock I cannot pick." He suspected she was the source of the genetic anomaly. What he didn't yet understand was that Catherine herself might not be entirely human. At least, not in the way we understand humanity. Here's where it gets darker. Dr. Ashford wasn't the first doctor to examine the Donnelly children. He was the third. The first two doctors had come through the valley in 1872 and 1874, both under circumstances that raised questions. The 1872 visit was recorded as a routine vaccination effort, part of a territorial health initiative. But when you dig into the records, there was no territorial health initiative in Montana in 1872. The program didn't exist. The doctor's name listed in the records, Dr. Samuel Brennan, doesn't appear in any medical registry, any census data, any ship manifest or immigration record. He's a ghost. A fabrication. Someone used a false identity to gain access to the Donnelly family, examine the children, and then vanish from history completely. The 1874 visit is even more suspicious. A doctor named Dr. Francis Whitmore supposedly treated Sarah for a broken arm. The medical report describes the injury in detail, notes the healing process, documents the treatment. But here's the problem. Sarah never broke her arm. Every other document, family letter, school attendance record where one existed, shows no indication of injury. So why did a doctor file a detailed medical report about treating a non-existent injury? Because he wasn't there to treat an injury. He was there to examine the children under false pretenses. Some organization with resources and reach, was monitoring the Donnelly family. They were sending agents disguised as doctors, creating false medical records, building a file. And the question that should terrify you is simple. If they were monitoring the Donnellys with such precision and deception, how many other families were under surveillance? How many other genetic anomalies were being tracked, documented, and controlled by a shadow medical establishment that operated outside official channels? The answer is going to shake you. Because the Donnellys weren't unique. They were just the ones who got documented before the cover-up could be completed. Dr. Ashford sent his findings to 3 institutions. Harvard Medical School, his alma mater. The Smithsonian Institution, which had recently established a division for anthropological research. And the newly formed American Medical Association, which was supposed to be the authoritative body on medical standards and practices. He sent identical reports to all 3. Detailed measurements, behavioral observations, genetic hypotheses as far as they could be understood in 1876, and a request for guidance on further study. Harvard never responded. The Smithsonian sent a brief acknowledgement letter stating they'd received the materials and would review them in due course. The AMA response was the most revealing. They sent a 2-page letter, signed by the organization's president, dismissing Dr. Ashford's findings as frontier hysteria and unscientific speculation. They suggested he was suffering from isolation-induced delusion and recommended he return to the East Coast for professional recalibration. Think about that response. A Harvard-trained physician sends detailed medical documentation about a genetic anomaly, and the response isn't curiosity or investigation. It's dismissal and character assassination. They didn't say his findings were wrong. They said he was crazy for reporting them. That's not science. That's damage control. Dr. Ashford didn't return east. He stayed in Montana, and he continued studying the Donnelly family. But his correspondence reveals a growing paranoia. In letters to his brother, he mentions feeling watched. He describes men in dark coats who appeared in the nearby settlement, asking questions about him and the families he treated. He notes that his medical supplies were tampered with, medications replaced with placebos, instruments damaged in ways that seemed deliberate. By 1878, his letters become frantic. "They know what I've found," he wrote in March of that year. "They've known all along. The Donnellys are not an anomaly. They're a trial. And I fear I've become a liability simply by documenting their existence." 3 months later, Dr. Henry Ashford was found dead in his cabin. Official cause? Suicide by laudanum overdose. But here's the problem. Dr. Ashford's own medical journal, recovered years later, shows he was violently allergic to opiates. He would never have consumed laudanum voluntarily. He was murdered. And his death marked the beginning of the systematic erasure of the Donnelly family from historical record. After Dr. Ashford's death, the Donnelly family disappeared from official documentation for nearly 2 years. No census records. No land transactions. No medical visits. Nothing. It's as if they ceased to exist between 1878 and 1880. But they didn't leave the valley. Neighbors who passed through the area in those years reported seeing the family, the children growing, the parents aging. One traveler mentioned in his diary that he stopped at the Donnelly homestead for water and found the family peculiar but hospitable. He noted that the children seemed uncommonly aware, watching me with eyes that seemed to see through pretense. When the family reappears in records in 1880, it's in a land deed transfer. The Montana Territory government purchased the Donnelly homestead for an undisclosed sum. The transaction was marked confidential and sealed under territorial security provisions. Why would a remote homestead in Montana require confidential purchase terms? What strategic value could that land possibly hold? Unless it wasn't the land they wanted. Was the family. The deed shows Patrick and Catherine Donnelly relocated to a new property 40 miles north, a larger plot with better soil and access to water. On paper, it looks like an upgrade, a generous offer from a government trying to encourage frontier settlement. But the new property came with conditions. A doctor would visit the family every 3 months for health monitoring. The children would be subject to educational assessment by territorial authorities twice per year. And the family would refrain from discussing their medical history with external parties. Those aren't relocation terms. That's captivity dressed up as assistance. The Montana government, or whoever was operating through the Montana government, had essentially placed the Donnelly family under soft surveillance. They couldn't leave without permission. They couldn't speak about their condition. And they would be examined on a regular schedule, their genetic anomalies documented and studied under the guise of public health policy. This is the playbook. This is how control operates. You don't round people up and put them in camps. That's visible, messy, creates resistance. You offer them help. You give them resources. You make them dependent. And then you own them. The Donnellys had become property. Human research subjects in an experiment they never consented to participate in. Between 1880 and 1885, something happened to the Donnelly children that the records only hint at. Michael, the oldest, who would have been 13 in 1880, stops appearing in any documentation after 1882. No death certificate. No marriage record. No census entry. He simply vanishes at age 15. Sarah, the second child, is listed in an 1884 territorial school registry, but her name appears with a note, transferred to Eastern Facility for Advanced Study. She was 11 years old. What kind of advanced study requires an 11-year-old frontier girl to be sent across the country? Thomas and Catherine, the younger two, remain with Patrick and Catherine Donnelly through 1885, but a medical report from that year describes them as docile and compliant, responsive to therapeutic intervention. Therapeutic intervention. In 1885, that phrase had very specific meanings in medical literature. It meant sedation, behavior modification, chemical treatment. They were drugging the children, keeping them manageable, preventing the full expression of whatever genetic traits they carried. And here's what should terrify you about this. These weren't isolated decisions made by frontier doctors acting alone. This was coordinated. Someone was tracking these children, deciding who stayed, who was transferred, who disappeared. Someone had the authority to override parental rights, to move children across territories without documentation, to conduct medical experiments without consent. In 1885, there was no federal agency with that kind of power. No institutional framework that could operate across state and territorial lines with that level of secrecy. Officially, it didn't exist, but functionally it did, and it still does. The infrastructure of control that managed the Donnelly family never went away. It evolved. It became legitimized. Today we call it public health policy, genetic screening, child protective services. But the core function remains the same. Identify, monitor, control, suppress. The Donnellys were early test subjects in a system of biological surveillance that now operates on a scale they couldn't have imagined. And the most disturbing part? Most people in that system, the doctors, the social workers, the administrators, have no idea they're part of it. They think they're helping. They're not. They're maintaining a structure of control that was built on the bodies of families like the Donnellys. Let's talk about what the genetic anomalies actually were. Because the medical descriptions, scattered across the few surviving documents, reveal something that shouldn't be possible with natural human genetics. The Donnelly children weren't just unusual. They were hybrid. Dr. Ashford's notes describe a phenomenon he called reactive chromatic shift in the eyes. The iris would change pigmentation in response to external stimuli, not just emotional state. Light levels, proximity to certain materials, even the presence of specific individuals would trigger color changes. That's not a genetic mutation. That's a biological sensing system. Their bone structure showed signs of accelerated healing and abnormal flexibility. Thomas broke his wrist in 1881, documented in a medical report. The fracture healed completely in 8 days. Normal healing time for a child's wrist fracture is 4 to 6 weeks. His bones were regenerating at a rate 5 times faster than baseline human physiology. The cognitive abilities weren't just high intelligence. They were predictive. Sarah could anticipate questions before they were asked, completing sentences for adults she'd just met. Michael demonstrated knowledge of historical events he'd never been taught, describing European cities he'd never seen with accuracy that stunned the few educated visitors who encountered him. Anne Catherine, the youngest, exhibited what one observer called emotional contagion on a mass scale. When she was upset, everyone in proximity became distressed. When she was calm, agitation in others would dissipate. She was somehow transmitting emotional states through a mechanism that had no explanation in contemporary psychology or biology. These aren't random mutations. This is engineered biology. Someone, at some point in the Donnelly lineage, introduced genetic material that doesn't exist in the natural human genome. And the question you need to ask is simple. Who had the knowledge and technology to do that in the mid-1800s? The answer is going to take us somewhere you're not prepared for. But you need to hear it. Because the Donnellys aren't ancient history. They're a preview of where humanity is headed. And the people controlling that trajectory don't want you to know it's already begun. The prevailing theory in the whispered corners of genetic research, the parts that don't get published in journals, is that Catherine Donnelly wasn't born. She was placed. The complete absence of her maiden name from records isn't administrative error. It's intentional erasure because there was no maiden name to record. She appeared in Patrick's life in the late 1860s, a woman with no past, no family connections, no documented origin point. Patrick met her in Chicago, according to one surviving letter, at a medical charity event. Which raises immediate questions. Why would an Irish immigrant laborer be attending a medical charity event in Chicago? Those were high society functions attended by doctors, philanthropists, wealthy industrialists. Patrick had no business being there. Unless he was brought there. Unless someone arranged that meeting. The letter, written by Patrick's cousin in Ireland, mentions that Patrick seemed enchanted by the strange woman, unable to speak of anything else, as if his will had been captured. That's not romantic language. That's control language. Patrick didn't fall in love. He was selected. Catherine was placed into his life, they married within 3 months, and they moved to the most remote location they could find in Montana Territory. Away from witnesses. Away from documentation. Away from anyone who might ask questions about the woman with no past and the children she would bear. Here's what the genetic evidence suggests, and this is where it gets truly disturbing. Catherine's DNA, or what we can extrapolate from descriptions of her physiology, contained markers that don't appear in any known human population. Not rare markers. Absent markers. Traits that suggest her lineage diverged from baseline humanity at some point in the distant past. Either she was the product of an isolated genetic line that had been breeding in secrecy for centuries, maintaining traits that the rest of humanity lost or never had, or she was the result of genetic engineering conducted long before the public discovery of DNA. Both options are terrifying, because either one implies the same thing. There is a hidden bloodline, a genetic elite, that has existed alongside humanity for longer than our historical records acknowledge. And they have been conducting breeding experiments, genetic trials, testing what happens when their biology mixes with ours. The Donnelly children were the result. Not accidents. Experiments. This is where some of you will want to dismiss what you're hearing as conspiracy theory. And I need you to resist that impulse. Because the evidence is documented. Not in mainstream sources, but in military medical archives, in sealed territorial records, in the private papers of frontier doctors that were never meant to be public. In 1889, 13 years after Dr. Ashford first examined the Donnellys, a U.S. Army medical officer named Captain Edmund Reeves filed a report with the War Department describing physiological abnormalities in civilian populations of the Montana Territory requiring federal investigation and potential quarantine measures. The report was classified immediately. It remained sealed until 1974, when it was accidentally released during a Freedom of Information Act request related to something completely unrelated. Researchers stumbled on it, buried in a box of documents about territorial infrastructure. Captain Reeves had been sent to Montana to investigate reports of genetic contamination in several frontier families. The Donnellys were on his list. So were 4 other families scattered across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. All shared similar traits: unusual eye coloration, accelerated healing, cognitive abnormalities, emotional transmission effects. Captain Reeves' report recommended immediate relocation of all affected families to controlled research facilities in the East where their conditions could be properly studied and contained. The War Department approved the recommendation. By 1891, all 5 families had been relocated. The official story was that they'd been offered government assistance, jobs in industrial centers, better opportunities. The reality? They were taken. And here's the thing. This pattern repeats, not just in the 1880s, throughout American history. Families with unusual genetic traits, unexplained abilities, physiological anomalies, they get identified, they get monitored, and eventually they get absorbed into systems that study them, control them, and prevent them from spreading their traits into the general population. Sometimes it's overt. Sometimes it's wrapped in assistance programs, medical care, educational opportunities. But the result is the same. The bloodline gets controlled, and the knowledge of what they represent gets buried. Because if people knew that there were genetic lines among us that possess abilities beyond normal human baseline, the entire social order would destabilize. Every hierarchy, every power structure, is based on the assumption of biological equality. We're all human. We all have the same potential. But what if that's a lie? What if there are bloodlines with capabilities we can't match, no matter how much we train, how much we study? That's not a comfortable truth. That's an apocalyptic truth. And the people managing this secret will do anything to keep it contained. Patrick Donnelly died in 1893. The death certificate lists heart failure. He was 54 years old, which was young even by 1890 standards for a man of his apparent health. But more important than how he died is where he died. He didn't die in Montana. He died in Washington, D.C., at a facility called the National Institute for Public Health Research. That facility didn't officially exist. There's no record of its establishment, no government appropriation for its construction, no staff listings, no patient records. But it appears in scattered references throughout late 19th century military and medical correspondence. It was a black site. A research facility where the government conducted medical experiments on civilians without public knowledge or oversight. Patrick Donnelly was taken there, held there, and died there. Why? Because by 1893, someone had decided that the genetic mystery of the Donnelly family needed to be understood at the deepest level. And the only way to do that was through dissection, tissue sampling, complete biological deconstruction. Patrick's body was never returned to Montana for burial. No gravesite exists. His remains were kept as research material. Catherine Donnelly's fate is even more obscure. She vanishes from all records after 1894. No death certificate. No mention in any document. It's as if she was simply erased. But there's one cryptic reference in a medical journal from 1901, 7 years after her disappearance. A Dr. Nathaniel Cross published a paper titled Observations on Prolonged Lifespan in Non-Standard Human Subjects. The paper describes a woman in her 60s who exhibited no signs of aging beyond her mid-30s, with cellular regeneration rates that defied known biological limits. The woman is never named. But the physical description matches Catherine Donnelly exactly. If that was her, it means she didn't die in 1894. It means she was alive, being studied, her abnormal longevity treated as another data point in an experiment she couldn't escape. And here's the truly dark implication. If Catherine's physiology allowed her to live decades beyond normal human lifespan, and if that trait was genetic, then her children would carry it too. Which means Michael, Sarah, Thomas, and Catherine Donnelly might have lived well into the 20th century, far longer than any record acknowledges. They could have been alive in the 1920s, the 1940s, even the 1960s, still under institutional control, still being studied, their extended lives proof of genetic engineering that predates our official understanding by a century. Where are they now? Where are their children if they were allowed to reproduce? And how many people walking around today carry Donnelly genetics without knowing it? Because here's the thing about engineered bloodlines. They don't disappear. They dilute, they hide, but the traits remain dormant, waiting for the right combination of genes to reactivate them. The Donnellys aren't extinct. They're hidden. And if you're watching this, if something about this story resonates with you on a level you can't explain, there's a chance you're carrying their legacy in your DNA. Let me pull back for a moment and show you the bigger picture. Because the Donnelly family isn't an isolated incident. It's a node in a network. In 1883, while the Donnellys were under surveillance in Montana, a family in Vermont named the Holloways was under similar observation. 7 children, all exhibiting extreme mathematical ability and shared telepathic connection. They could solve complex equations as a group, each child contributing pieces of the solution simultaneously without verbal communication. In 1887, the Patterson family in Oregon demonstrated multi-generational immunity to diseases that killed everyone around them. Smallpox, influenza, cholera. These diseases ravaged frontier communities, but the Pattersons never got sick. Not once. Not any of them. In 1891, the Corey family in Wyoming exhibited what doctors called predatory awareness. They could sense danger before it manifested, predict ambushes, know when predators were nearby. Frontier life was brutal, but the Coreys survived situations that killed seasoned outdoorsmen, as if they had a sixth sense for threat detection. All of these families were documented. All of them were relocated. All of them disappeared into government systems that swallowed them whole. And here's the pattern that emerges when you map it out. These families weren't random. They were clustered in specific regions, frontier territories, isolated populations, places where genetic experimentation could be conducted with minimal outside observation. Some organization was using the American frontier as a laboratory. They were placing individuals with engineered genetics into remote communities, allowing them to breed and then monitoring the results. The Donnellys were one trial. The Holloways, Pattersons, Coreys, they were others. And when the traits manifested, when the experiments produced results, the families were harvested. Taken, studied, and either terminated or absorbed into breeding programs that continued the work on an even deeper level. This wasn't medicine. This was agriculture. Human agriculture. Genetic crop management. And the people running these programs didn't answer to the U.S. government. They operated through the government, using territorial authorities and military structures as cover. But their allegiance was to something older, something that transcends national borders and political systems. What were they trying to create? Why go through centuries of effort to engineer specific human traits? The answer is control. Not control over these families. Control over humanity's genetic future. They were building a map of human potential, identifying which traits could be activated, which abilities could be unlocked, and then suppressing that knowledge so it could be weaponized later. The Donnellys weren't victims of random genetic lottery. They were product. And so are you. Here's where this gets personal. In 1923, the United States government established the Eugenics Record Office, an official institution dedicated to studying and improving the American gene pool. They framed it as public health, improving the breeding stock of the nation, preventing genetic disease. The reality? It was a front for continuing the work that had been done on families like the Donnellys. The ERO collected genetic data on millions of Americans. They tracked bloodlines, documented traits, identified families with unusual characteristics. And they made recommendations. Who should be allowed to breed? Who should be sterilized? Who represented genetic value and who represented contamination? This wasn't fringe science. This was mainstream policy supported by universities, funded by philanthropic organizations, endorsed by the medical establishment. And it didn't end when the eugenics movement fell out of favor after World War II. It went underground. The terminology changed. We stopped calling it eugenics and started calling it genetic counseling, family planning, public health genomics. But the infrastructure remained. The data collection continued. Today, when you submit your DNA to a consumer genetics company, when you participate in medical research studies, when you allow your newborn's blood to be collected for state health databases, you're feeding that same system. They're still mapping the human genome. They're still identifying unusual traits. They're still tracking bloodlines. And families that show up on their radar, families with genetic markers that suggest engineered ancestry, they don't get rounded up anymore. That's too obvious. Instead, they get offers. Medical studies with generous compensation. Educational opportunities for their gifted children. Health monitoring programs that provide free care in exchange for data. It's seduction, not abduction. And it works because most people don't realize they're being harvested. They think they're lucky. They think someone noticed their potential and wants to help. They don't understand that they're descendants of experimental bloodlines, and the people offering help are the same organization that created those bloodlines in the first place. The Donnellys were obvious because the technology was crude and the traits were dramatic. Today's engineered genetics are subtle, traits that look like natural variation, high IQ that seems like good luck, physical resilience that gets attributed to good genes and healthy living. You don't know your product because you've been designed to blend in until you're needed, and then you get activated. Let's go deeper into the mechanism of control. How do you manage a population that contains genetically engineered bloodlines without anyone noticing? You create a system where the engineered individuals self-identify and voluntarily enter containment. It's brilliant in its simplicity. You don't hunt them. You make them hunt themselves. Step 1. Create a mythology of exceptionalism. Tell people that some humans are gifted, special, more capable. Frame it as natural selection, evolution, genetic lottery. Make it desirable to be identified as exceptional. Step 2. Build identification mechanisms that feel like opportunity. Standardized testing in schools. Gifted programs. Talent searches. College aptitude assessments. These aren't neutral measurements. They're screening tools designed to identify cognitive patterns that correlate with engineered bloodlines. Step 3. Route identified individuals into controlled environments. Elite universities, think tanks, research institutions, government programs, corporate leadership tracks. These aren't just career paths. They're sorting mechanisms that concentrate engineered genetics in places where they can be monitored, utilized, and prevented from destabilizing the broader population. Step 4. Incentivize compliance. If you play along, if you succeed within the system, you get wealth, status, influence. If you resist, if you ask too many questions, you get marginalized. Your career stalls. Opportunities dry up. You're labeled difficult, unstable, conspiracy-minded. The social cost of resistance is higher than the benefit of compliance, so most people comply. They don't even realize they're being managed. And here's the dark brilliance of this system. It recruits its own administrators from the managed population. People with engineered genetics end up running the institutions that control engineered genetics, but they don't know that's what they're doing. They think they're helping society. They think they're advancing knowledge. They're not. They're maintaining a prison that holds their own bloodline captive while rewarding them with the illusion of power. The Donnelly children, if they'd been born today, would have been identified as gifted at age 5, placed in accelerated programs by age 7, recruited into elite institutions by age 18, and by age 30, they'd be working for the very system that experimented on their ancestors, never knowing their entire life path was predetermined by genetics they didn't choose. That's not conspiracy. That's infrastructure. And you're living in it right now. The question you should be asking at this point is, who built this system? Because it predates any modern institution. The first documented cases of families like the Donnellys appear in European records from the 1600s. Same patterns. Unusual genetic traits. Remote locations. Sudden disappearances. Back then they called it witchcraft. The Inquisition wasn't just about religious control. It was about identifying and eliminating bloodlines that carried traits the church couldn't explain or control. Families accused of witchcraft weren't practicing magic. They were demonstrating biology that looked like magic to people who didn't understand genetics. Healing abilities, precognition, emotional influence, physical resilience. These are the same traits documented in the Donnellys 2 centuries later, which means the bloodlines survived the Inquisition. They went underground, scattered, hid. And some organization with continuity across centuries, kept tracking them. By the time the American frontier opened up, that organization had refined its methods. Instead of burning the bloodlines at the stake, they studied them. Instead of eliminating the genetics, they tried to harness them. The American frontier was perfect for this. Vast, remote, outside the scrutiny of established European powers. You could place experimental subjects in isolated territories, let them breed, monitor the results, and no one would notice. Frontier doctors became field agents. Territorial governments became administrative cover. And families like the Donnellys became test subjects in a multi-generational experiment. But here's what changed in the 20th century. The organization conducting these experiments stopped hiding behind governments and started building its own institutions. Foundations. Research institutes, pharmaceutical companies, biotech firms. Today, they don't need to place people in remote locations to study them. They can collect genetic data from millions through consumer DNA testing. They can monitor populations through electronic medical records. They can identify bloodlines through genealogy databases that people voluntarily contribute to. The Donnellys had to be physically isolated to be studied. They're studying you right now, through your phone, through your medical history, through every genetic test you've ever taken. And if you carry markers they're interested in, you're already on a list. Not a government list. Something older. Something that views governments as temporary administrative structures and operates on a timeline measured in centuries, not election cycles. Who are they? The answer is going to sound insane. But by the end of this, you'll understand why it's the only explanation that fits the evidence. There's a reason most people can't grasp what I'm describing. Your mind resists it. Not because you're stupid, but because the resistance is engineered. Let me explain. In the early 1900s, a psychologist named Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered the field of public relations. His insight was simple but devastating. Human behavior can be controlled through narrative. You don't need force. You need story. Tell people the right story, repeat it enough times, make it emotionally resonant, and they'll believe it without question. They'll defend it. They'll attack anyone who questions it. Bernays worked with governments, corporations, intelligence agencies. He showed them how to control populations through information management. And one of his key strategies was compartmentalization. You don't hide the truth completely. That creates curiosity and resistance. Instead, you fragment the truth into 1,000 pieces and distribute them across conflicting narratives. Some people believe one version. Some believe another. Most believe fragments of several versions. And no one sees the complete picture because they're too busy arguing about which fragment is correct. The Donnelly story exists in fragments. Some historians know about frontier genetic anomalies but dismiss them as medical misdiagnosis. Some genealogists have documented the family's disappearance but attribute it to frontier hardship. Some conspiracy researchers talk about government breeding programs but can't produce hard evidence. Each group holds a piece. None see the whole. And when someone tries to connect the pieces, they get labeled as fringe, dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, marginalized by every institution that benefits from keeping the fragments separated. That's not accidental. That's design. The people managing this secret understand that the best way to hide something isn't to bury it completely. It's to bury it in plain sight, surrounded by so much noise that no one takes it seriously. They've trained you to dismiss exactly the kind of information that would liberate you. And the training is so effective that even right now, part of your mind is trying to find reasons to disbelieve what you're hearing. That resistance isn't you. That's programming. And the Donnellys, their story, their bloodline, it's one of thousands of threads that, when pulled together, reveal a tapestry of control that spans centuries. But most people never pull the threads. They live their entire lives believing the narrative they've been given, never realizing they're part of an experiment they didn't consent to. You have a choice. Keep resisting or start connecting the dots yourself. Because what I'm about to show you next will make everything clear. Now let me ground this in something you can verify. The Donnelly narrative I've constructed draws from real historical patterns that are documented, even if this specific family represents a synthesis of multiple cases. Let's talk about what actually happened in American frontier medicine that mirrors this story. Between 1870 and 1920, the U.S. government conducted systematic studies on isolated populations under the guise of public health initiatives. The Tuskegee syphilis study is the famous example, running from 1932 to 1972, but it wasn't the first. Frontier populations, immigrant communities, Native American reservations, these were all sites of medical experimentation that occurred without informed consent. The Indian Health Service, established in 1955, has documented cases of forced sterilizations and medical experiments on Native populations that continued into the 1970s. Records show women sterilized without consent, children subjected to nutritional experiments, entire communities used as test subjects for pharmaceutical trials. This isn't conspiracy theory. These are admitted facts, documented in government archives, the subject of official apologies and settlements. The infrastructure was real. The willingness to use vulnerable populations as experimental subjects was real. And the genetic research component? That's real too. The Eugenics Record Office I mentioned earlier, that existed from 1910 to 1939 at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York. It was funded by the Carnegie Institution and supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. It collected genetic data on millions of Americans, created pedigree charts tracking bloodlines, and made recommendations that led to forced sterilization laws in 32 states. Over 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under eugenics programs. The Supreme Court upheld these laws in 1927 in Buck v. Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That legal precedent has never been overturned. So when I describe a system that identifies, tracks, and controls genetic bloodlines, I'm not inventing fiction. I'm describing documented historical practice, extended through logical progression. The Donnelly family, as I've presented them, is a composite, a narrative synthesis of real cases that shared similar elements. Let me show you the actual historical threads this story weaves together. In 1886, a family in Virginia named the Fugits became medically documented for a condition called methemoglobinemia, which turned their skin blue. For generations, this family lived in isolated Appalachian regions, intermarrying, concentrating a rare genetic trait. Medical researchers studied them extensively, documented their genetics, tracked their bloodline. The Fugits were real. Their genetic isolation was real. Their use as medical research subjects was real. In 1890s Vermont, there were documented cases of families with extreme mathematical savant abilities, multi-generational patterns suggesting genetic transmission of specific cognitive traits. Records from state institutions show these families were studied, Their children often removed for educational opportunities that turned into institutional confinement. In Oregon, indigenous populations demonstrated disease resistance that baffled frontier doctors. When smallpox and influenza killed European settlers, some native communities showed dramatically lower mortality rates. This wasn't superstition, it was genetics. And those populations became subjects of medical study, often coercive, that attempted to isolate the genetic factors behind their resistance. The pattern of placing people in remote locations, monitoring them, and eventually relocating them to research facilities mirrors real programs. The National Leprosarium in Louisiana, established in 1894, forcibly confined patients for decades, conducting research without consent. The Willowbrook State School in New York intentionally infected mentally disabled children with hepatitis to study disease progression from 1956 to 1970. These aren't ancient history. These programs operated in living memory. Your parents or grandparents were alive when this was happening. So the Donnelly narrative isn't fabricated from nothing. It's a pattern recognition exercise, connecting documented cases across time and geography to reveal the systematic nature of genetic experimentation on American populations. The specific family might be constructed, but the system that would create and manage such a family absolutely existed. And here's what should terrify you: it never stopped. Let's talk about what's happening right now, today, that follows the same pattern. In 2013, the National Institutes of Health launched the All of Us research program, with a goal of collecting genetic data from 1 million Americans. The stated purpose is advancing precision medicine, understanding genetic factors in health and disease. The program is voluntary, participants are compensated, everything appears ethical and transparent. But let's examine the structure. Participants provide DNA samples, detailed health histories, ongoing medical data through electronic health records. This information goes into a centralized database accessible to researchers across government and private institutions. The data is supposedly de-identified, but multiple studies have shown that genetic data can be re-identified with over 90% accuracy using publicly available information. So everyone who participates in All of Us is creating a permanent genetic profile that can be linked back to them, tracked across their lifetime, and accessed by entities they'll never know about. That's the Donnelly surveillance system, modernized and legitimized. But it's voluntary, so it's acceptable. Now consider, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and similar consumer genetic services have collected DNA from over 30 million people worldwide. These companies partner with pharmaceutical corporations, share data with research institutions, and have terms of service that allow them to use your genetic information for purposes beyond the ancestry report you purchased. In 2018, 23andMe signed a $300 million partnership with GlaxoSmithKline, giving the pharmaceutical giant access to genetic data from millions of customers. That data is being used to develop drugs, identify disease markers, and map genetic variations across populations. This is genetic agriculture. They're farming human DNA, identifying valuable traits, and monetizing the genetic information of millions of people who thought they were just finding out their ethnic background. The Donnelly children were monitored by frontier doctors who filed reports with shadowy institutions. Today, you monitor yourself, voluntarily providing genetic data, health metrics, behavioral patterns through apps and services you pay for the privilege of using. You're a more efficient research subject than the Donnellys ever were because you're conducting your own surveillance and labeling it self-care, ancestry research, health optimization. The control system didn't go away. It got so sophisticated you don't recognize it as control. You experience it as convenience. Here's where the historical and the speculative intersect in ways that should make you deeply uncomfortable. Everything I've described so far, the frontier medical surveillance, the eugenics programs, the modern genetic data collection, these are documented facts. Now let's explore the logical implications that institutions don't want you thinking about. If genetic experimentation on American populations occurred throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and if that experimentation was systematic rather than isolated incidents, then there must be continuity. Programs this extensive don't just start and stop randomly. They evolve. The organizations conducting this research in the 1880s weren't government agencies in the way we understand them. They were private entities operating through government infrastructure. Medical societies, research foundations, philanthropic organizations. These entities don't answer to elected officials. They're funded by generational wealth, they operate across decades regardless of which party controls Congress, and they view their work as transcending politics. This is historical fact. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Institution, the Harriman family fortune, all funded eugenics research in the early 1900s. They didn't stop when eugenics became politically unpopular after World War II. They rebranded, changed terminology, shifted focus to genetics, biomedicine, public health. The institutions are still there. The funding lines are still active. And the research continues under new names with new justifications. So when we talk about bloodlines being tracked and managed, we're not describing a conspiracy that requires secret meetings and shadowy cabals. We're describing institutional continuity. Organizations that have been conducting the same research for over a century, accumulating data, refining methods, and leveraging new technology to expand the scope of their work. The Donnellys would have been a data point in their 19th century research. You're a data point in their 21st century research. The methodology has changed. The core objective, understanding and controlling human genetic potential, remains constant. And here's the question that should keep you awake at night. What are they building toward? You don't conduct multi-generational genetic research just to understand. You do it to apply, to engineer, to create. If you're still with me at this point, you've crossed a threshold. Most people check out before now because the implications are too destabilizing. But you're here, which means some part of you recognizes the pattern. Some part of you has always sensed that the official narratives don't explain what you observe in the world. Let me make this personal. If you've ever felt like you see things others don't, if you've experienced abilities or intuitions that seem beyond normal human baseline, if you come from a family with unusual traits that don't quite fit standard genetics, you need to consider the possibility that you're carrying engineered bloodline markers. Not everyone is. Most people are baseline human, natural genetic variation, nothing engineered. But some carry traits that were introduced into human populations intentionally centuries ago, and have been tracked through genealogical records ever since. How do you know if you're one of them? You probably already suspect. There's a recognition that happens when you encounter information about genetic engineering programs. Most people dismiss it intellectually but feel nothing emotionally. If you're reacting with something deeper, anxiety, excitement, recognition, that's your biology responding to information about itself. This isn't mystical. It's genetic memory, epigenetic markers that activate when you encounter contextually relevant information. The engineered bloodlines weren't just physically different. They were psychologically different, carrying cognitive patterns that made them question authority, seek hidden knowledge, resist social conditioning. These traits were features, not bugs. The people engineering these bloodlines wanted individuals who would think independently, push boundaries, challenge systems. Why? Because they were breeding problem solvers. Tools for tasks that required capabilities beyond normal human range. And once those tools were created, they needed to be controlled, managed, aimed at appropriate targets. The frontier families were early prototypes. Modern carriers of these bloodlines are more refined, more integrated into normal populations, harder to identify. But the markers are still there, expressing in subtle ways. High pattern recognition, resistance to social pressure, difficulty accepting explanations that don't account for complexity. These aren't personality traits. They're genetic expressions. And if you carry them, someone, somewhere, has your genetic profile in a database. They've been tracking your family for generations. And they have plans for you. Now I need you to do something. If what I'm describing resonates with you on a level that feels like recognition rather than just intellectual interest, I want you to comment 2 words, I remember. Not because it's magic. Not because it's a ritual. But because it's a marker. A data point that indicates you're self-identifying as someone who recognizes these patterns. And yes, I'm aware of the irony. I'm asking you to voluntarily identify yourself in the same way I've been describing people being tracked. But here's the difference: conscious participation. If you're going to be tracked anyway and you are, then you might as well own it. Might as well signal to others like you that you see what they see. This isn't about the algorithm, though yes, it helps with that. This is about creating a visible network of people who understand what I'm describing, who recognize the pattern, who are ready to start thinking about what comes next. Because here's what the people managing these genetic programs don't expect. They expect the monitored bloodlines to remain passive, to accept opportunities when offered, to flow through the institutional channels that have been built to contain them. What they don't expect is awareness. What they don't expect is carriers of engineered genetics recognizing their own status and choosing to operate outside the control systems. That's the threat, not rebellion. Awareness. So comment, I remember, if you're ready to acknowledge what you've always suspected about yourself. And if you're not ready, that's fine too. But understand that your hesitation isn't random. It's the control system working through your own psychology, making you afraid to identify yourself, making you prefer safety over truth. The Donnellys didn't have a choice. They were born into visibility, their traits too obvious to hide. You have camouflage. You can pass as baseline human, which means you can stay safe, stay hidden, stay controlled. Or you can step into visibility and find out what you're actually capable of when you stop pretending to be normal. Let's get back to the historical framework and connect it to what's emerging today. The genetic engineering programs that created families like the Donnellys weren't working toward a single goal. They were building a toolkit. Different bloodlines carried different traits. Some had cognitive enhancements, mathematical ability, pattern recognition, linguistic facility. Some had physical advantages, healing, endurance, sensory acuity. Some had psychological traits, emotional influence, charisma, persuasive ability. Each bloodline was a different experiment, testing what was possible when you introduce specific genetic modifications into human populations. By the early 1900s, enough data had been collected that the organizations running these programs could start crossbreeding bloodlines, combining traits, creating individuals who carried multiple enhancements. This is where the eugenics movement becomes relevant in ways history textbooks don't discuss. The public face of eugenics was about preventing defective people from breeding, sterilizing the mentally ill, the disabled, the socially undesirable. That was the cover story. The real program was positive eugenics, identifying superior bloodlines and encouraging them to interbreed. Elite families, old money lineages, certain immigrant populations with desirable traits, these were guided into marriages that concentrated genetic advantages. Not through force, through social engineering. The right introductions at the right parties. Scholarships to specific universities where they'd meet similar individuals. Career paths that put them in proximity to others with complementary genetics. By the 1950s, this process had become so refined that the individuals involved had no idea their marriages were being influenced. They thought they were falling in love, pursuing attraction, making free choices. They weren't. They were following genetic compatibility that had been identified and cultivated by organizations tracking their bloodlines for generations. Today, this process is algorithmically optimized. Dating apps don't just match you with people based on stated preferences. They analyze behavioral patterns, communication styles, decision-making processes, and biological markers extracted from the data you provide. These patterns correlate with genetic traits. The algorithms are breeding programs disguised as matchmaking services. And the most disturbing part? It works. People who meet through these platforms report higher relationship satisfaction, better compatibility, more successful partnerships. Because the matching isn't random. It's designed. And the designers have access to genetic databases that allow them to identify which pairings will produce children with desirable trait combinations. You think you're swiping right on someone you find attractive. You're being guided toward genetic combinations that serve a breeding agenda you're not aware exists. The children being born today from these algorithmically matched partnerships, what do you think they represent? They're the next iteration of the Donnelly experiment, but with three critical differences. First, the traits are subtler. Instead of eyes that change color, they have cognitive abilities that look like high intelligence. Instead of accelerated healing, they have robust immune systems that seem like good health. The enhancements are designed to pass as natural variation. Second, the scale is massive. The Donnellys were one family in Montana. Today's breeding programs operate globally, through platforms used by hundreds of millions of people. The data collection is comprehensive, the matching is precise, and the output is thousands of enhanced children born every year. Third, the integration is seamless. These children aren't isolated in frontier territories. They're distributed throughout normal populations, attending regular schools, living in regular communities, invisible until their traits are needed. This is the endgame of centuries of genetic engineering. Not creating obvious superhumans who would provoke resistance. Creating a distributed network of enhanced individuals who don't know they're enhanced, who integrate seamlessly into existing power structures, and who can be activated when necessary. What does activation look like? It looks like opportunity, a scholarship to the right university, a job offer from the right company, an introduction to the right mentor. These aren't random strokes of luck. They're systematic recruitment of individuals who carry genetic markers that have been tracked and managed for generations. The people making these offers are often carriers themselves, earlier generations of the same program, now in positions of power and tasked with identifying and developing the next generation. It's a self-perpetuating system. The enhanced breed more enhanced. The system expands. And baseline humanity, people without engineered genetics, they become increasingly irrelevant to the power structures that shape society. Not oppressed, not eliminated, just marginalized. Because in a world where genetic advantages are this significant, meritocracy is a lie. You can't compete with someone whose cognition operates at twice your speed, whose emotional intelligence was engineered into their genome, whose pattern recognition was optimized before they were born. The Donnellys were the proof of concept. You're living in the implementation phase. And if you're carrying the markers, you're either part of the system or you're wasting potential they've been cultivating for generations. Let's talk about the resistance to this information. Because even now, even with everything I've laid out, part of your mind is trying to reject it. That rejection isn't weakness. It's design. One of the most sophisticated aspects of genetic engineering programs is the inclusion of psychological fail-safes that prevent carriers from recognizing their status. Think about it logically. If you're breeding enhanced humans for specific purposes, you need them functional in normal society until they're needed. If they grew up knowing they were genetically superior, they develop superiority complexes, become arrogant, draw attention, create problems. So you engineer humility into the psychology. You make them doubt themselves. You give them imposter syndrome. You make them feel like frauds even when they're succeeding. This isn't accidental. It's a control mechanism built into the genetics themselves. Enhanced individuals are designed to underestimate their abilities, to attribute their successes to luck or circumstance, to constantly seek external validation. This keeps them manageable. It keeps them from recognizing the pattern. And it ensures that when someone like me comes along and says, "You're genetically engineered, you're part of a multi-generational breeding program," your first instinct is rejection. Not because the evidence isn't compelling, but because you're psychologically primed to reject information about your own enhancement. So here's how you break through that failsafe. You test it. You stop attributing your abilities to luck and start examining them systematically. When you predict outcomes with unusual accuracy, you document it. When you learn skills faster than people around you, you measure it. When you influence others emotionally without conscious effort, you observe it. Track your own performance against baseline human capacity. Be rigorous. Be skeptical. But be honest. And what you'll find if you're a carrier is that your abilities consistently exceed what should be possible for someone with your level of training and experience. That's not ego. That's data. And once you accept the data, once you stop dismissing your own capabilities, you can start asking the real question. If I'm enhanced, if my genetics were engineered, what was I designed to do? Because genetic engineering programs don't create random variations. They optimize for specific functions. And if you're carrying markers, you were built for something. The question is, do you want to fulfill the purpose you were designed for, or do you want to repurpose yourself? Do you serve the system that created you, or do you use the advantages it gave you to dismantle it? The historical record shows us what happens to people who recognize their status and choose resistance. Dr. Ashford, the frontier doctor who documented the Donnellys, he figured it out. He saw the pattern. He understood that he was observing controlled genetic experimentation, and he tried to expose it. He died under suspicious circumstances, his research was buried, and his name was scrubbed from medical history except for a few scattered references in territorial archives. That's the standard response to exposure. Not dramatic assassination, not public discrediting, just quiet erasure. You make the person disappear from the historical record, and in a few generations, it's like they never existed. But here's what changed in the 20th century with the development of mass media and distributed information systems. You can't erase someone anymore without drawing more attention. The internet, for all its flaws, creates permanent records that are nearly impossible to completely eliminate. So the strategy shifted. Instead of erasure, you get flooding. You drown accurate information in a sea of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and deliberate disinformation. Someone tries to expose genetic engineering programs, and suddenly there are 50 fake whistleblowers making outrageous claims that discredit the entire topic. Someone documents evidence of breeding programs, and it gets packaged alongside flat earth theories and reptilian overlord narratives until the average person can't distinguish signal from noise. This is active measures, the Soviet intelligence term for information warfare designed to confuse rather than conceal. And it works brilliantly. Because now, when you encounter real information about genetic engineering, you're primed to dismiss it. You've been trained to associate this entire category of information with crazy people on the internet. That training didn't happen by accident. That's decades of careful narrative management, flooding the zone with garbage so that when someone presents actual evidence, it gets lost in the static. So how do you separate signal from noise? You follow the institutional behavior. Don't trust what organizations say. Watch what they do. When consumer genetic testing companies quietly change their terms of service to allow broader data sharing, that's signal. When pharmaceutical corporations pay hundreds of millions for access to genetic databases, that's signal. When government health agencies launch massive genetic collection programs with vague justifications, that's signal. The noise is the conspiracy theories about alien DNA and secret cabals. The signal is the documented, verifiable behavior of institutions that have the resources and motivation to conduct genetic research on populations without informed consent. The Donnellys weren't abducted by aliens. They were monitored by doctors working for organizations that still exist today under different names. That's not speculation. That's pattern recognition. Now let's address the philosophical implications that make this information so dangerous. If genetic engineering creates meaningful differences in human capability, if some people are literally born with advantages that others can never acquire through effort alone, then every foundational belief about equality, meritocracy, and human potential becomes questionable. Democracy is based on the idea that all citizens have roughly equal capacity for rational decision-making. What happens when some citizens have cognitively enhanced genetics that give them pattern recognition and strategic thinking abilities far beyond baseline human? The vote of an engineered individual isn't more valuable legally, but it's more valuable practically because their analysis is more accurate. Capitalism is based on the idea that anyone can succeed through hard work and intelligence. What happens when intelligence is genetically determined and some people are born with optimized cognition that makes them naturally superior competitors? The self-made success story becomes a myth. Hard work doesn't overcome genetic advantage. Social justice movements are based on the idea that differences in outcomes are due to discrimination and systemic barriers. What happens when some differences in outcomes are due to genetic engineering that created actual capability gaps? Not all disparities are oppression. Some are biology. These aren't comfortable conclusions. They violate deeply held beliefs about human equality and potential, which is exactly why this information is suppressed. Not because it's false, but because accepting it would destabilize every social system we've built on the assumption of biological equality. The people managing genetic engineering programs understand this. They know that public awareness of significant genetic stratification would cause social collapse. So they maintain the fiction of equality while privately operating breeding programs that create inequality. They tell you anyone can succeed while ensuring that the genetically enhanced capture most positions of power. They promote narratives of social mobility while tracking bloodlines and guiding carriers into predetermined paths. It's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It's a maintenance operation. They're maintaining social stability by hiding a truth that would shatter the foundational myths of modern society. And most people in the system, the teachers, the corporate managers, the government officials, they're not aware of this. They genuinely believe in equality and meritocracy. They don't know they're administering a stratified system because they're not operating at the level where those decisions are made. The Donnellys were visible proof that human genetics could be engineered for superior traits. That proof had to be buried not because it was false but because it was true. And that truth, scaled to modern populations, would end civilization as we know it. So what do you do with this information? Because that's the real question. Knowledge without application is just mental masturbation. Let me be clear about your options. Option 1. Reject everything you've heard, decide I'm a conspiracy theorist, close this video and go back to your normal life. You'll be comfortable, safe, and controlled. You'll live according to the path that's been laid out for you, achieve what the system allows you to achieve, and die never knowing what you could have been. That's not cowardice. That's a rational choice in the face of overwhelming institutional power. Option 2. Accept the information intellectually but do nothing with it. Become a knowledgeable prisoner, aware of your cage but unwilling to test its boundaries. This is where most people end up. They recognize the truth, they see the pattern, but they don't act on it because action carries risk. They optimize within the system instead of challenging it. They achieve success on the system's terms while knowing those terms are rigged. This is the option the system prefers, actually. Aware subjects who stay compliant are more useful than ignorant subjects because they self-manage more effectively. Option 3. Accept the information and test your own capabilities systematically. If you carry genetic markers, start pushing the boundaries of what you think you're capable of. Document your performance. Track your results. Build evidence of your own enhancement. And then decide what to do with that evidence. This is the dangerous option because once you have proof of your own genetic advantage, you can't unknow it. You'll either have to serve the system that created you or actively resist it. There's no neutral position once you have that level of self-knowledge. Option 4. Reject the system entirely. If you're enhanced, use your advantages to operate outside institutional control. Build independent power structures. Create networks with other awakened carriers. Refuse the offers when they come, decline the opportunities that feel suspiciously well-timed, and forge your own path. This is the most difficult option because you'll be fighting against institutional power that's been accumulating for centuries. But it's the only option that leads to actual freedom. The Donnellys didn't get to choose. They were identified before they understood what that meant. You have something they didn't. Awareness before activation. Use it. Let's get tactical. If you decide you're in option 3 or 4, if you're committed to testing yourself or operating outside the system, here's what you need to understand about how the monitoring works. Every interaction with institutional systems generates data. Medical visits, genetic testing, psychological evaluations, educational assessments, employment applications, these aren't just administrative processes. They're screening mechanisms. The data flows into centralized databases that track genetic markers, cognitive patterns, and behavioral traits. This isn't speculation. In 2018, the Department of Health and Human Services proposed regulations that would allow federal researchers to access individual health records without patient consent for research purposes. The regulation was framed as reducing bureaucratic barriers to important medical research. The reality? It created legal infrastructure for warrantless surveillance of medical data on the entire American population. That regulation passed with minimal public attention. Today, your medical records can be accessed by government researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and academic institutions without your knowledge or permission. They're building genetic profiles on hundreds of millions of people. If you want to minimize your exposure, you need to understand that any biological sample you provide, blood draws, cheek swabs, tissue samples, Any genetic test you take, even if it's through a private consumer company, that data can be subpoenaed, purchased, or accessed through partnership agreements. 23andMe's terms of service explicitly state they can share data with law enforcement and research partners. When you spit in that tube, you're not just getting ancestry information. You're entering a database. So here's the operational security protocol. Minimize institutional contact. Avoid elective genetic testing. Use cash for medical services when possible to avoid creating insurance records. Don't participate in research studies, even ones that seem benign. Don't upload your genetic data to genealogy websites. And understand that if you have children, their genetic data is being collected at birth through newborn screening programs that are mandatory in all 50 states. Those blood samples are supposed to be destroyed after testing. They're not. They're stored indefinitely in state databases. Your children are in the system before they leave the hospital. This isn't about paranoia. This is about understanding the infrastructure of surveillance that's been built around genetic data and making informed choices about your exposure. You can't opt out completely, not if you want to function in modern society. But you can minimize your profile, reduce your visibility, and maintain enough operational security that you're not easily tracked. Now let's talk about what the enhanced are actually being prepared for. Because the centuries of genetic engineering, the tracking, the breeding programs, the systematic enhancement of specific bloodlines, this wasn't done for abstract purposes. It was done to create a population capable of managing the transition humanity is approaching. We're entering a period of radical technological and social change that will require capabilities beyond baseline human range. Artificial intelligence that can outthink humans in narrow domains. Genetic engineering technology that allows direct modification of human embryos. Life extension therapies that will create extreme age and wealth stratification. Climate change forcing massive population displacement. Resource scarcity that will require zero-sum decisions about who gets access to food, water, energy. These aren't distant problems. They're emerging crises that will peak in the next 20 to 50 years. And the people managing human genetic engineering programs understand that baseline humanity isn't equipped to handle them. Not morally. Not intellectually. Not emotionally. You need decision makers who can process complexity at a higher level, who can make ruthless calculations without emotional override, who can manage populations through crises that would break normal human psychology. That's what the enhanced bloodlines are for. They're being prepared to be the administrators of the collapse. Not the survivors. Everyone in power survives. The administrators, the people who decide how resources get allocated, who gets access to life extension, which populations get culled, and how the narrative gets managed so the remaining baseline humans don't revolt. This is why the enhancements aren't just cognitive. They include psychological traits that make it easier to make difficult decisions without moral paralysis. Reduced empathy for outgroups. Enhanced loyalty to institutional authority. Comfort with hierarchy and inequality. These aren't bugs. These are features. The enhanced were designed to be comfortable doing what baseline humans find morally repugnant. And here's the darkest part. Most of the enhanced don't know this is what they're being prepared for. They think they're just smart, successful, naturally talented. They don't realize they're being groomed to administer the largest population management program in human history. The Donnellys were a trial run in small-scale genetic management. The coming decades are the full implementation. And if you're enhanced, you're going to be offered a role in that implementation. The question is whether you'll take it. Here's what acceptance looks like in practice. You'll be in your 20s or 30s, established in a career, demonstrating competence and discretion. Someone will approach you. Not obviously. Not with a job offer from the secret genetic engineering conspiracy. It'll be subtle. A mentor who takes unusual interest in your development. A headhunter for a prestigious organization that somehow knows details about you that aren't public. An invitation to a conference or retreat where you'll meet others who seem remarkably similar to you. The pitch will never be explicit. They won't tell you about genetic engineering or breeding programs or population management. They'll talk about leadership opportunities, exclusive networks, and access to information and resources that aren't available to the general public. They'll tell you that you've been identified as someone with exceptional potential, that they want to invest in your development, that they're building a community of high performers who can tackle civilization-scale challenges. And it'll be attractive, because they're offering real power, real resources, and real community with people who think like you do. For someone who's felt isolated their entire life, who's always been more capable than their peers but couldn't explain why, this feels like coming home. This feels like finally being recognized for what you are. That's the seduction. They're not tricking you. They're offering you exactly what you've always wanted: recognition, purpose, community, and the resources to fully express your capabilities. And in exchange, all they ask is loyalty, discretion, commitment to the institutional mission. You don't have to do anything immoral. You don't have to hurt anyone. You just have to trust that the people running the system know what they're doing, that the decisions being made are necessary, that your role is to optimize within the structure rather than question the structure itself. Most enhanced individuals accept, because the alternative is rejecting power, community, and purpose in favor of isolation and struggle. That's not an easy choice, and the people making the offer know that. They've been refining this recruitment process for decades. They know exactly which psychological buttons to push. The Donnellys didn't get offered this choice. They were simply controlled. You get offered the illusion of choice: serve voluntarily or remain outside but powerless. Both paths are predetermined, but one feels like agency. So how do you resist when the system is offering you everything you've ever wanted? This is the central test. This is where most enhanced individuals fail, not because they're weak, but because they're rational. Refusing power in exchange for principles sounds noble, but it's functionally suicidal when you're opposing institutional authority that controls resources at civilizational scale. The answer isn't dramatic refusal. That just gets you neutralized. The answer is strategic acceptance with internal resistance. You take the position. You enter the network. You gain access to resources and information, but you maintain psychological independence. You don't internalize the institutional mission. You don't accept their framing of what's necessary. You stay aware that you're operating inside a system designed to use you. And then you wait. You build capacity. You develop your own networks parallel to the institutional ones. You document what you observe. You prepare for the moment when resistance becomes possible, when the institutional system is vulnerable, when action can have meaningful impact. This isn't heroism. This is long-term strategic thinking. The system can't be fought from outside because it controls all the resources. It can only be disrupted from inside by people who've gained access and trust but retain their independence. This is what the system fears most. Not external resistance, which they can crush. Internal operators who understand the system but refuse to serve it, who use institutional resources to build alternative power structures, who recruit other enhanced individuals into networks that operate according to different principles. This requires patience. You might spend decades building position before you can act. You might never see the payoff in your lifetime. But if you're genetically enhanced, if you carry bloodline traits that give you advantages others don't have, you have a responsibility to use those advantages for something other than serving the system that created them. The Donnellys couldn't resist because they had no awareness, no warning, no choice. You do. That awareness is your only real advantage. Use it or lose it. Because once you enter the institutional system without maintaining internal resistance, once you fully integrate and accept their mission, you're no longer capable of resistance. You become the system. And the cycle continues. Let's talk about the families who said no. Because they exist even if you've never heard their names. Throughout the 20th century, there were bloodlines that recognized they were being tracked and refused to cooperate. They didn't fight dramatically. They just disappeared. Changed names, moved frequently, avoided institutional contact, refused genetic testing, educated their children outside traditional systems. This is documented in genealogical gaps, families that appear in census records and then vanish, leaving no paper trail for generations. Some of these families remain hidden today, living on the edges of society, maintaining genetic lines that the tracking systems lost. But here's what happened to most of them. By the third generation, without institutional support, without access to resources, Without the educational and economic opportunities that come from cooperation, their descendants regressed to baseline. The genetic advantages were still there in the DNA, but without environmental activation, without proper nutrition, stimulation, and development, those genes never expressed fully. This is the brutal reality. Genetic potential means nothing without resources to develop it. A cognitively enhanced child raised in poverty without education will never reach their potential. The enhancement requires institutional support to manifest. That's why resistance through isolation doesn't work. The system doesn't need to hunt you if you're making yourself irrelevant. So the families that successfully resisted did something different. They built parallel institutions. Private schools that operated outside state oversight. Medical networks that didn't report to public health systems. Economic structures based on trade rather than documented transactions. Communities that were self-sufficient enough that they didn't need external support. These communities still exist, scattered across rural America, operating in legal gray zones, maintaining genetic lines that the official tracking systems don't have full data on. But they're small. Resource poor compared to the mainstream system. And every generation they lose members to institutional seduction. Because it's hard to stay isolated when the outside world offers so much. This is the strategic problem that resistance faces. The system isn't evil enough to unite people against it, and it's attractive enough that most people choose integration over independence. The only successful resistance is internal disruption from people who've integrated while maintaining awareness. That's you, if you're enhanced, if you're reading this, if you're recognizing the pattern. You're the potential internal disruptor, and the choice you make in the next few years will determine whether you serve the system that created you or corrupt it from within. Now I need to address something crucial. What if you're not enhanced? What if you're baseline human reading this and recognizing that you don't have the markers, the abilities, the signs? First, understand that baseline doesn't mean inferior. It means natural, unmodified. Human in the way humans evolved to be over hundreds of thousands of years. There's dignity in that. There's authenticity in that. But let's be honest about the practical reality. In a world where some humans are genetically engineered for superior performance, baseline humans are at a disadvantage. Not morally. Not in terms of human value. But practically in terms of capability and power. So what do you do with that information? Option 1. Accept the hierarchy and find your role within it. This is what most baseline humans do without knowing it. They work for enhanced individuals, support institutional systems run by enhanced administrators, and live functional lives without ever recognizing the genetic stratification. That's not shameful. That's survival. Option 2. Build alternative value. If you can't compete on cognitive or physical traits, compete on loyalty, reliability, craft skills, emotional intelligence that isn't engineered. These have value. Enhanced individuals need support networks. They need people they can trust who aren't competing for the same positions. Baseline humans who understand the game and choose to support enhanced operators who resist the system. That's a powerful alliance. Option 3. Focus on baseline human advantages. Enhanced individuals carry psychological weaknesses built into their engineering. They're designed for specific functions, which means they lack flexibility. They're optimized for institutional hierarchy, which means they're uncomfortable with chaos. They're cognitively superior but often emotionally stunted. Baseline humans who develop emotional depth, spiritual groundedness, and adaptive flexibility can operate in spaces the enhanced can't access. Option 4. Radical acceptance and exit. If the game is rigged genetically and you can't change your genetics, refuse to play. Build a life outside institutional systems, outside competitive hierarchies, outside the entire structure that privileges genetic enhancement. This is the hardest path because modern life is designed to be nearly impossible without institutional integration. But it's the most authentic path for baseline humans who refuse to serve enhanced interests. The Donnellys were enhanced, but they were also prisoners. Sometimes the real freedom is being unremarkable enough that no one tracks you. Let me tell you about the timeline we're on. Because everything I've described, the genetic tracking, the breeding programs, the enhancement of specific bloodlines, this has been building toward a specific moment. and we're approaching it now. In the next 10 to 20 years, genetic engineering technology will become widely accessible. CRISPR and next-generation gene editing will allow direct modification of human embryos at a level of precision that makes current techniques look primitive. This will create a decision point for humanity. Do we allow genetic enhancement to become commercial, available to anyone who can afford it? Or do we restrict it, maintaining the system where only selected bloodlines carry engineered traits? Both options are catastrophic in different ways. If enhancement becomes commercial, you get genetic stratification at hyperspeed. The wealthy engineer their children for maximum advantage. Within 3 generations, there's a biological caste system that makes current inequality look mild. The enhanced become a separate species, incompatible with baseline humans for reproduction. Humanity splits. If enhancement remains restricted, if governments try to ban or control it, you get a genetic black market. Underground clinics offering unregulated modifications. Rich people engineering their kids illegally. A shadow population of enhanced individuals with no tracking, no oversight, no predictable traits. That's arguably worse because at least the current system monitors and controls what gets engineered. Either way, the secret is coming out. The genetic engineering programs that have operated in shadow for centuries are about to become public knowledge, either through technology democratization or through exposure. And when baseline humanity learns that there's been a hidden program breeding enhanced humans for generations, the social upheaval will make every previous crisis look manageable. This is why the enhanced are being activated now. This is why recruitment is intensifying. This is why people who carry the markers are being pulled into institutional systems faster than previous generations. The managers of these programs know the secret can't be maintained much longer. They're positioning enhanced individuals in key decision-making roles so that when the revelation happens, when baseline humanity reacts, the people controlling the response are genetically optimized for crisis management. The Donnellys were 19th century prototypes. You're living in the final preparation phase before the secret becomes public. And what you do in the next few years will determine which side of history you're on when the split becomes visible. Here's the question that should be consuming you. Why are you hearing this now? Why is this information reaching you at this particular moment in your life? I can give you the surface answer. Because you clicked on a video, because the algorithm showed it to you, because you were curious. But that's not the real answer. The real answer is that you were ready for this information. Something in your life circumstances, your psychological state, your level of awareness, made you receptive to hearing what most people would reject immediately. That's not coincidence. If you're enhanced, your genetics include psychological traits that activate at specific life stages. Late teens, early 20s, there's often a recognition phase where you start noticing you're different. Late 20s, early 30s, there's often an isolation phase where you recognize that normal social structures don't fit you. Mid-30s, 40s, there's often an awakening phase where you start seeking explanation for patterns you've observed your entire life. The fact that you're here listening to this suggests you're in one of those phases. And the people who manage genetic programs know these phases exist. They time their recruitment to coincide with them. Which means if you're enhanced, you're probably going to get approached soon. Someone will offer you something that seems too good to refuse. And you'll have to decide whether that timing is coincidence or design. If you're baseline but resonating with this material, it suggests something different. You're in proximity to enhanced individuals. You work with them, live with them, have relationships with them. And some part of you has been sensing the difference without having language for it. This information gives you that language. It explains the dynamic you've been feeling. And now you have to decide what to do with that awareness. Do you treat the enhanced people in your life as allies or competitors? Do you support their development or resist their influence? These aren't abstract questions anymore. The Donnellys were identified by external observers. Today, identification happens internally. You recognize yourself or you recognize others, and that recognition forces action. You can't unknow what you now know. The only question is what you'll do with the knowledge. Let's address the obvious question. Is any of this verifiable? Can you prove the Donnelly family existed? Can you prove there are genetic engineering programs that predate official genetic science? And my answer is, partially. The Donnelly family as I've described them represents a synthesis, a narrative construction built from scattered historical fragments. There were families with unusual genetic traits in frontier territories. There were medical experiments on isolated populations. There were institutional programs tracking bloodlines. But the specific Donnelly family with the exact traits I've described? That's a story built to illustrate a pattern, not a documented historical case. And I'm being explicit about that because the truth is more important than the narrative. You need to distinguish between documented history and interpretive synthesis. Everything about eugenics programs, genetic data collection, medical experimentation on vulnerable populations, institutional surveillance of bloodlines, that's verifiable through public records and academic research. The existence of enhanced genetic traits in specific family lines, the systematic breeding programs coordinating those bloodlines, the activation and recruitment of enhanced individuals into institutional power structures, that's inference based on the verifiable facts. Logical extrapolation. Pattern recognition. Could I be wrong? Yes. The pattern I'm describing could be less centralized, less intentional, less coordinated than I'm suggesting. What looks like a centuries-old genetic engineering program could be coincidental clustering of natural genetic variation combined with normal institutional sorting mechanisms. But here's why I don't think that's what's happening. The pattern is too consistent, too distributed across time and geography, and too aligned with institutional behavior that makes no sense unless there's a genetic management agenda. The pieces fit together too well to be random. So I'm presenting you with a framework, a way of understanding historical and contemporary phenomena that conventional explanations don't adequately address. You should verify everything you can verify. You should remain skeptical of everything that requires inference. And you should trust your own observations about genetic variance in human capabilities and the institutional systems that sort and manage those variances. Because whether the Donnellys existed exactly as I described or not, the system I'm describing definitely exists. You're living in it. And recognition of that system is the first step toward choosing your relationship to it. So what happens next? If you've made it this far, if you've listened to 40 sections of genetic engineering history, institutional control mechanisms, and uncomfortable truths about human stratification, you're different than you were at the beginning. Not because I changed you. Because you allowed yourself to consider possibilities you'd previously dismissed. That's growth. That's awakening. And it's irreversible. You can't go back to seeing the world the way you did before this information entered your consciousness. Now comes the hard part, integration. You have to take this framework, this way of understanding genetic hierarchies and institutional control, and decide how it applies to your specific life circumstances. If you're enhanced, you need to evaluate your trajectory. Are you on a path that was chosen for you or by you? Are the opportunities you've received random or systematically provided? Are you being developed for a purpose you haven't been told about? And most importantly, do you want to fulfill that purpose or subvert it? If you're baseline, you need to evaluate your relationships. Are the people you work for, report to, or defer to in your life actually more capable than you, or are you assuming they're more capable because you've been conditioned to accept genetic hierarchy? Are you supporting systems that optimize for enhanced performance while marginalizing baseline human value? And most importantly, do you want to compete in genetic hierarchies or build alternative value structures? These aren't questions with obvious answers. These are questions that require deep self-examination, brutal honesty, and willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about your own capabilities and limitations. The Donnellys never got to ask themselves these questions. They were managed from birth, monitored, controlled, and eventually absorbed into systems that used them without their consent. You have the advantage of awareness. You know the game exists. You know the rules even if you don't know all the players. That knowledge is power, but only if you act on it. Otherwise, it's just anxiety. Just paranoia. Just another conspiracy theory that makes you feel informed but doesn't change anything about your actual life. So here's my challenge to you. Take one action in the next week that tests this framework. If you think you're enhanced, push yourself harder than you normally would and document the results. If you think you're baseline, identify one relationship where you've been deferring to someone else's judgment and question whether that deference is warranted. Make the framework actionable. Because information without action is just entertainment. And what I've described is too important to be entertainment. Before we close, I need to talk about the emotional weight of this information. Because if what I've described resonates with you, if you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, you're probably feeling a complex mix of emotions right now. Validation because something you've sensed your entire life finally has explanation. Anger because you realize you've been managed without your knowledge or consent. Fear because you understand the forces you're up against. Isolation because you can't share this information with most people in your life without being dismissed as crazy. These are normal responses. These are healthy responses. And you need to honor them instead of suppressing them. Because the system counts on you suppressing these emotions. The system counts on you being too afraid to act, too isolated to build networks, too concerned about social judgment to pursue the truth. That's the control mechanism. Not physical force. Emotional management. So let yourself feel what you're feeling. Let yourself be angry about the genetic engineering programs that created hierarchies you didn't consent to participate in. Let yourself be afraid of the institutional power that tracks bloodlines across generations. Let yourself be isolated until you find others who see what you see. And then use those emotions as fuel. Anger becomes motivation. Fear becomes caution and strategic thinking. Isolation becomes selectivity about who you trust. The emotions aren't weaknesses. They're data points telling you that something significant has shifted in your understanding of reality. The Donnellys, assuming they were real in the way I've described, probably felt these emotions when they realized they were being observed, studied, controlled. They didn't have the conceptual framework to understand genetic engineering or institutional surveillance. They just knew something was wrong. You have the framework. You have the language. You have the ability to name what's happening and make informed choices about how to respond. That's privilege. That's power. Use it wisely. Use it carefully. But for God's sake, use it. Because if you're enhanced and you waste your advantages serving a system that views you as product, that's tragedy. And if you're baseline and you spend your life competing in genetic hierarchies instead of building alternative value, that's also tragedy. Neither path honors what you actually are. Neither path leads to freedom. So here's where we end. Not with answers but with a framework. Not with certainty but with tools for investigation. The Donnelly family, whether they existed precisely as described or represent a pattern synthesized from multiple historical cases, they're a mirror. They show us what happens when genetic advantage meets institutional control. They show us the mechanisms of surveillance, breeding programs, and systematic management of human biology. And they show us the choice that exists for anyone who recognizes they're part of these systems. Serve or subvert. Integrate or resist. Accept the advantages and the strings attached, or refuse the advantages and build independent power. There's no neutral path. There's no way to have the benefits without the control. That's the trade-off. And it's been the trade-off since these programs began, whenever that was. Centuries ago. Millennia ago. The timeline matters less than the pattern. So what's your choice? If you're enhanced, are you going to wait for the recruitment that's probably coming? Or are you going to preemptively build alternative networks with other awakened carriers? Are you going to accept positions of institutional power with the understanding that you're being positioned for crisis management? Or are you going to refuse those positions and accept the limitations that come with refusing? If you're baseline, are you going to compete in genetic hierarchies where you're structurally disadvantaged? Or are you going to build value in domains where genetic engineering doesn't provide advantage? Are you going to support enhanced individuals who resist the system? Or are you going to resent them for advantages you don't have? These questions don't have right answers. They have your answers. Based on your values, your risk tolerance, your vision of what human civilization should become. The Donnellys didn't choose. They were chosen. You're choosing right now. And that choice will compound over the rest of your life, determining your trajectory, your relationships, your legacy. Choose consciously. Choose strategically. And whatever you choose, own it completely. Because the worst possible outcome is making half choices, staying partially aware but unwilling to act, seeing the pattern but refusing to engage with it. That's paralysis. That's prison. And you're better than that. Remember, I remember. Not as magic. As recognition. You've been carrying this knowledge somewhere beneath conscious awareness your entire life. Now it's conscious. Now it's available. Now you decide what to do with it. The story of the Donnelly family is over. Your story is just beginning. Make it count.